Ask a layperson on the street what makes for a successful business, and they're likely to guess that the biggest businesses just outspend their competition, whether that's on sales, marketing, R&D, or M&A. In other words, that they're already successful. For decades, success in the business of baseball was believed to follow the same idea. If you spend more, you win more. Spend the most, I guess you win the most. Then, someone stepped up to the plate with a different, disruptive idea. What if, rather than outspend, you could outsmart your competition? Welcome to another episode of the AI Forecast, proudly sponsored by Cloudera. I'm your host, Paul Mueller. Join me, along with leading companies and industry experts, as we explore the past, the present, and the future of data and AI in the enterprise. Today, we're joined by the legendary Billy Beane. He is currently a senior advisor to Oakland Athletics owner John Fisher and the former executive vice president of baseball operations for the Oakland Athletics. He's also known as the pioneer behind what has come to be known as the Moneyball philosophy, which inspired both the book and the movie of the same name. Welcome to the AI Forecast podcast, Billy.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on board. Before we jump in to talk a bit about Moneyball, we do something to kind of limber up before every podcast. Speaking of disruptive, we move our lightning round to the front. Are you ready to do this?
Well, we're going to find out, aren't we?
All right, let's give it a crack. First up, what would people say is your superpower? People who know you best.
Oh, man. Well, I'm only going to quote a friend of mine who said the other day, now this is his words, not mine, so I apologize. He says sense of humor, but he may be the only one who thinks that. But again, I think try not to, I'd like to think, well, this probably doesn't sound right, but I like to say humility and realizing that you probably aren't the smartest guy in the room.
I love that. Next up, we talk a bit about technology on this podcast. So what, in your opinion, is the most impactful technology of all time? You can go as far back as you want.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to state the obvious, but for me, I would say the internet combined with a smartphone.
Slightly different question for you. Do you think organizations are effectively tapping their data today?
Yeah, again, I listen, I think you can always be more effective, but I think if you having that conversation now and ask that question now, certainly they're doing it much more efficient, much better way than they were, say, 20 years ago when all of this started. This sort of, when we started doing what we were doing, data wasn't necessarily cool, and it wasn't that we were looking for it to be cool. For us, it was a tool to be successful. But now data is cool, and I think combined with technology, we all have access to it. Which, in fact, we're somewhat overwhelmed by it. All you have to do is just think about the Super Bowl and all the ads that you have in regards to data and information as it relates to betting and gambling and things like that. So I would say that we probably are just now tapping into what we can do, but it's certainly at a much greater level than we were, a few years ago.
All right. Well, related question then. We all kind of have, I think, hacks or best practices that help us be more effective with the data we've got. What are some of the best practices you've learned as someone who works with data?
Listen, I think, again, going back to that first question, my superpower, I think my superpower is hiring really smart people. And when I sort of combine that with the other question you asked about humility, is realizing that there's some incredibly bright, particularly in sports, passionate people that I could tap into. So again, the superpower that I had was, again, having the humility to surround myself with people who are far brighter than myself, who ultimately help me answer the question that you just asked, which is tapping into that data. Again, I've surrounded myself with some brilliant people in my career, and I think each person that I come in contact with, that I associate with myself professionally, is brighter than the next.
It's a great philosophy to have, which is, sometimes knowing when you need to go and find someone else to help you work on a problem. Let's talk a bit about your background, because you played the game, if I understand correctly. You went on to be GM, then EVP. Tell us a bit about what experiences most influenced how you built your decision-making model for today.
Yeah, well, a lot of it was, I started as a player. In baseball, it was most of the people who ended up running the baseball business were either former players or people came up in the business. And I sort of came up in a traditional route. I was a professional player for 10 years. Had signed out of high school as a first-round draft pick by the New York Mets and played 10 years professionally, and parts of 6 of those years in the major leagues. And it was some of my own experience which really shaped how I would view the game when I became an executive. Now going back a little bit, I always dreamed as a little kid of wanting to be a professional baseball player. But to be totally frank, I really wanted to run my own baseball team. To be honest with you, I wanted to be the guy that picked the players. I wanted to ultimately get into an ownership position. I was as much a fan of the game as I enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed playing. So I always had a long-term goal in mind to use my playing career, hopefully as a platform to become a baseball executive. And it was really my own experience as a player, and some of my experiences in life and some of the people I grew up around with. I had a very close friend who'd learned to count cards in Las Vegas, and he explained that whole philosophy to me. I had a friend who was also who was a mathematics major, who was taking the actuarial exams in the late 80s and explaining to me exactly what an actuary did. So I started dealing with data and probability, when I was was exposed to it when I was a player. And then my own experience again as a player, I came into a business that made evaluation, that made judgments on its most important asset, which was player ability, by using their eyes and their guts. They made, they'd watch a player and they try and predict how good a player he was going to be down the road, despite the fact that they had all this information in the form of baseball statistics that was essentially baseball's form of data that would probably do a better job in helping them predict that player performance. So simply put, I was a highly rated prospect coming out. I wasn't a particularly great major league player. I was proud of the fact that I played in the major leagues, but I was kind of a classic case of an overvalued asset. I sort of looked the part. I passed the eye test, and but I didn't pass the data test, which means I didn't do the things data-wise that a really good baseball player does. And it was my experience as sort of being this overvalued asset that really, started my thinking that when I ran my own club, I was going to do things different, mainly because I thought there was a better way. And quite frankly, there was people outside the industry, guys like Bill James and Pete Palmer, Earnshaw Cook. These were baseball academics that for years have been saying that, that teams were mispricing baseball players' skills and that we weren't using, data to help us make these decisions. And I was reading these books and it made sense to me. And all of this, again, in my own experience as a player, was really the beginning of the foundation of what I would take and do when I took over the club in the late 90s with the A's.
So you find yourself in the late 90s in charge of the A's. It's probably, I'm going to guess, from my own experience in getting one of those promotions or those dream jobs, it's simultaneously gratifying and terrifying because suddenly you've got all of these people looking at you going, okay, fix it. What did you find when you got there and how did you go about working on the problem?
Well, you do make a good point. I wouldn't say I was terrified, but I was excited. But because, listen, running a major league or a professional sports team at that level is, it's a public position with a lot of pressures and a lot of expectations. But I was really fortunate because I was hired by a gentleman who was really my business mentor, a gentleman named Sandy Alderson, who was the general manager at the time. And he promoted me to the same position while he became the club president. He came up in a traditional way himself. He was not a former player. He was actually a lawyer, a Harvard Law graduate, and a former Marine. And so he really was one of the other. Really, I would say he sort of capped my education and was the one who really drove a lot of my thinking when I was able to take over the club for myself, because he came up in a non-traditional way and learned the game very much the way an academic would. He didn't learn it the way most people learn baseball, which is playing the game, which was more emotional and visceral. Sandy was a very sort of pragmatic, practical, and sort of step-by-step disciplined person. And he just opened my eyes of seeing the game and seeing the business in a much different way. And in some respect, had I not been hired and come up with a guy like that, it might have completely changed my career, to be honest with you, because he really had, his background was not the normal background for a sports executive. Again, you don't see a whole lot of Harvard Law graduates who happen to be Marine Corps officers taking over sports teams. So I was really, really fortunate to have a great mentor, and that really got me off to a great start. In the way beyond my own experience, was the way I looked at the game was working under Sandy Alderson.
Yeah, giving you the permission to try and look at the business through a different lens. Was there a specific moment where, I guess, when you went into the leading the team, where you looked at the scouting process and the process of building up your player list, where you thought, hang on a minute, the data's telling me a different story than maybe what the orthodoxy would have done?
Yeah, well, many times. Yeah, there was many times where, say, the anecdotal opinions of somebody didn't exactly match up to what the data would tell you, which was really, was not an opinion, which was a fact. There was a lot of time in many cases where it didn't align. And yet we were allocating dollars in most cases based on opinion and not based on this data. And there really, from my end, it seemed to be a real big disconnect, particularly for a club like ourselves who had very little capital risk. We had to make sure that everything we invested, that we got some return, and in most cases got more return than the dollar we invested. So again, the decisions that were being made at that time, it's not so much now, but the decisions then they were gut feel. They were it was very based on, a small amount of evidence. And in many, many cases, the data and the information that was provided on, a spreadsheet was completely ignored. And a lot of times that spreadsheet and those statistics actually meant something in terms of predicting player performance.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because I'm going to use the word excuses, but often when I'm consulting and working with businesses, a common trope you hear is, look, I can't make a more informed decision because we just don't have the data. Early on, was the data available? And if there were any limitations, how did you work around them?
Well, early on, it was pretty simple. In fact, the data we used, the great thing about baseball was that, one of the original business metrics was really baseball statistics. And since the game started in the mid 1800s, the one thing that baseball did was it kept track of player performance in the form of statistics going back to when the game started. And it was broadly available to everybody. Whether it be an executive or an 8-year-old kid who followed his favorite baseball team. We were lucky that was out there. It was and it was public. Now, as time went on, just like any other business, the data that we started collecting became a lot more granular. And but at the time, the statistics that were out there, anybody could draw upon them, anybody could use them. Quite frankly, it was free. So, but again, as times progressed, technology has allowed us to become, again, much more granular with the collection of data, with how much we collect, and as a result, the player performance models that are being created are a much better and much more detailed than they were. It was a very crude way of doing them when we first started. And again, there was nothing proprietary about what we were doing. Again, people like Bill James had been saying and doing for years. We just, in some sense, at the very beginning, kind of mimicked what they had written about. Mm-hmm. And our business kind of allowed us to do that because nobody else was doing it. And that was early on. Baseball has become a very, very, like a lot of businesses, a very, very sophisticated game in terms of how it collects data, how it uses data right now. And again, when I look at excerpts from Moneyball, I feel like I'm watching a Flintstones episode because it just seems so long ago and so simple compared to what's going on today.
I want to get to that in just a minute, but one of the big things I'm guessing you had to deal with was this shift from, as I say, the orthodoxy, where data was available but not used, to changing the culture and making data more centric to the decision process. What was the biggest challenge in flipping the culture?
Well, it was the culture itself. I mean, the thing about the culture, it had been around for 150 years or so, or certainly over 100 years. And the thing of cultures usually don't change unless they're forced to change. And the one thing about baseball is that from a business standpoint, it was very unique in that a poorly run baseball team, say if you lost 100 games, didn't go out of business. They just basically hit the reset button and started over the next year. So there really was no real motivation to drastically change the business model because you didn't really have bankruptcies, and bankruptcy has a habit of forcing businesses to change the way they do things.
So, sharpening the mind, as they say.
Yeah, and so baseball never had that, and even up until the '90s, people forget at one time the A's were one of the highest paying teams in the league in terms of what we paid our players back in the late '80s and early '90s. But the game really started to change a lot in the '90s. The have and the have-nots, the big market, small market teams, the gap between them really started to widen during the '90s, and teams were starting to get into, problems financially based on what they were spending. So that sort of forced us into a change. I mean, you can keep doing the same thing over and over again and operate as a business, but as soon as bankruptcy comes knocking at your door, you change. And in some sense, for us, that was, really the impetus for change.
I want to take a slightly different tack on the data problem, because it sounds like rather than having not enough data, which, as I say, is a common trope I hear, is you had the opposite problem, which is we've got so much data available that picking the data to focus on can sometimes be a problem. You get swamped with it. How did you figure out, was it your card counting friends or your other math nerds? How did you figure out which signals were the ones worth putting your money on and which ones were noise or could be ignored, or maybe were false signals? Because that's the other one, right? They can lead you down a path of confirmation bias to a bad place.
Well, early on, it was really, really simple, Paul. There was nothing that we invented. Bill James and other sort of baseball academics have been telling us for years. Probably the most important statistic in terms of winning baseball games was the ability to get on base. And it was a public statistic. And the advantage to us, being a small market team, was it was a skill that was paid at a rate of probably maybe the 9th or 10th highest paid skill in the game. In short, it was a skill that we could afford because teams weren't paying for it. And one of the reasons that they weren't paying for it was a lot of the players that had this skill didn't necessarily, in all cases, look like necessarily athletes. I mean, it was a skill more than an athletic move. When you looked at, again, a statistic that had the strongest correlation to winning baseball games, on base percentage had the strongest correlation. And from our perspective, the advantage we had was that we could afford it. So it was really, really simple. There was just a direct line between high on base percentage, scoring a lot of runs, and winning a lot of games. And it was really that simple. Now, over time, as teams became a lot more granular and started getting more and more information, more and more data. And also, quite frankly, what happened was on-base percentage at one time was probably one of the lower paid statistics in terms of how we were compensating it. To in a very short amount of time, very soon after the book came out, it became the number one paid skill in the game. So markets adjust.
That was going to be my question. Sorry to interrupt you, but the good news is you got famous. The bad news is you got famous. And, obviously as other teams figured out what you're up to, how did you find a new edge? How did you stay scrappy?
Well, what ended up really, I think the real revolution wasn't what happened afterwards was when not just us, but other teams, to the point where all the teams now, but started realizing the importance of data and collecting our own data and using that data to build more predictive models. When we first started making decisions, they were based on statistics. Statistics are a result. What teams, ourselves being one of them, started figuring out was there a better way of measuring process, which was a better predictor of skill? And the collection of data. And then also, quite frankly, it wasn't just the collection of data, but us bringing in some really, really bright, passionate people into our business that previously weren't working in the business. Because, as I said, most employees in baseball teams had come up in the business or they played the game. All of a sudden, and a lot of credit goes to somebody like Sandy Alderson, and then my first right-hand guy was a gentleman named Paul DePodesta, who was a Harvard econ major. A lot of really smart people started coming into the game. Teams were collecting data and information. They were creating their own proprietary player performance models with the use of data to, again, ultimately, like every business, baseball teams are just trying to predict the future. And again, every piece of information that we could collect between the white lines during a game. And in some cases, it even got to the point years later on where people were, filming and collecting data on workouts and biomechanic information, all things that, again, hopefully would either predict or help improve a player performance as the layers and layers and layers of these over the last 20 years start to happen. And now, again, a lot of these you don't hear about other than, teams are doing them because, baseball or private businesses, so don't necessarily have to share what they're doing. The thing about the book Moneyball was everything in that book was public information. There was I sort of have said this, is that we basically stole the ideas of Bill James. The culture allowed us to do it because nobody actually really ruthlessly tried the ideas of Bill James and what he talked about in his pamphlets for years. After that, the next 20 years, though, and again, as we sit here now, teams have become very private. They have very large analytics staffs with bright young men and women, helping them build these models using biometrics to help improve player performance. So it's gotten very, very sophisticated, far beyond even, I think, my understanding, to be totally frank.
So just to recap, you're collecting your own data, maintaining some proprietary data to give you an edge or an insight that perhaps others don't have. And obviously combining it with publicly available data is one of the things that helps keep performance sustainable.
And I think the other thing, too, I think now, I mean, I think everybody to some extent, I don't think anybody walks into any business meeting and declares that they're the non-data person in the world today. I think everybody to some extent is, quote, a data person. I think the real challenge now is, and I've used this line many times, is everybody's a data person until it doesn't back up their opinion. And that's where the real leadership comes into an organization. And I say that in sports because you can have all the information or proprietary information, but understand your public doesn't. So when you make decisions, you can get some pretty emotional responses, in particular to, say, trading their favorite player away because you've got data that suggests this is the time to do it. That's where the leadership principle comes into. And in sports, it's really challenging because almost everybody has some opinion on their local sports team. And, some of it very passionate, some of it, agnostic, but they usually have some awareness. And it's a very unique business where a 6-year-old and a 96-year-old and everybody in between has some sort of opinion, again, on what you do when you run that baseball team, which creates a very interesting dynamic for a leader.
I mean, what do you say to people who say that, and you might have had this conversation at some point in time, that, by being so focused on data, it's taken, the emotion and the art and I guess some of the mystique out of the process.
Yeah. That. Well, you know what? The genie's out of the bottle. I don't think that if the public and people have information available to them, and you got to understand teams have the information and more, that the idea that you aren't going to utilize it really seems kind of crazy. I mean, I've heard that idea that it's taken sort of the romance out of it. I like to think as an executive, it takes some of the guessing out of it, which is a much better process in my opinion. And one of the interesting things, as specific to sort of baseball, is for 100 plus years we've had umpires, and now we have technology that will help us determine whether a ball is a ball or a strike, and it's on TV, and we actually have a box that tells us whether it's a ball or a strike. And the idea that we have this technology, and the only person who doesn't really have the right answer is the one who makes the call, and the idea that we're going to ignore this seems sort of crazy. So I just I see the the evolution of making decisions and with data in business and in particular in sports. I think it's something, again, the genie's out of the bottle, and the idea that we go back to sort of a gut feel decision-making process, I think it's just not going to happen, because you have a whole generation of baseball fans who've been raised on data and information. My generation didn't have when I was growing up. That's how they were raised, and that's how they sort of, in some ways, they've grown to love the game. I mean, listen, when you can start broadcasting poker games on television, and people are watching it because of odds and probability, to me, that's just really just another example of data in the world today. I mean, the fact that we actually people will actually watch poker on TV, and it's all because it's now it's a data game. Data's out there for everybody, and it's just a fact of the world.
We've obviously talked about data, which is hard and empiric. During this process, I guess, of shifting the orthodoxy, you had to change people's minds, and I suppose you had to build a team around you. How important is it to hire for, I suppose, to hire for different points of view, to bring in people who are maybe going to think differently, to break the back of that problem? And I suppose, what are some of the challenges leaders have when trying to break that sort of entrenched way of thinking?
I mean, listen, it's a great question. And I'll use this more specific example. When we hired Paul DePodesta, when he was my right-hand guy, again, he was a Harvard econ major who had played, college sports and grown up as playing in high school, but really his normal career path after graduating from Harvard would have been, go work at one of the big banks or Goldman Sachs and go to business school. But now he's coming in and working in sports, and he comes in with no sort of, he comes in as a blank, a smart, but a blank canvas with no, bias, experience bias coming into the game. And the idea, and then ultimately, after Paul, there are a lot of, really bright guys and young men and women like Paul came into the game who didn't play the game, but were incredibly passionate about it and very, very, very bright. And again, this goes back to when we first started this conversation, us, and I say the A's, and it started with Sandy Alderson, having an open mind and not pre-qualifying people, particularly in sports, which it's easy to do. Well, if, the response you would get, particularly in baseball and most sports, is, what do you know? You never played the game. That's always the wall that's thrown up there. Well, that wall's been sort of busted down. And I'd like to think we were part of that, not only for bright young, men who love sports, but bright young women who love sports. And now you have access to all these people. And again, to me, that's the biggest change in the game. Baseball is the people that are now working in the game relative to when I started out. And again, I like to think that we had some hand in that in Oakland.
Without a doubt. And I suppose if I could just press on this question a little bit harder, having just watched the movie, maybe I'm feeling slightly, I've got this narrative twist in there that I'm looking at, is things don't always go to plan at the beginning. And the people who are sitting there going, well, I told you it wouldn't work. As a leader, how tough is it to navigate that point where you're confident in the idea, but the results aren't showing up quickly enough?
Well, it's actually a great question. And I sort of lean on my assistant, Paul. He used to say that if you were going to go into a math test and somebody was going to give you the answers, wouldn't you take them? We sort of felt like using data was sort of like that. They were giving you the answer to the test. Now, we wanted to leverage data and make a lot of decisions. We knew we weren't going to be right every single time, but we knew over the course of time, and this goes back to sort of card counting, we weren't going to win every hand. But if we were disciplined with the data and ruthless with the numbers and how we made decisions consistently, that over time we would. It was that discipline that we would be correct. So I think there was a lot of assumption that when we were doing things that we were nervous about how this was going to turn out. We sort of felt actually completely the opposite. We felt the use of data was a kind of a roadmap and a fog light for us. And again, we weren't going to be right every single decision, but if we were consistent with the way we made decisions over time, that we would end up where we wanted to be. And it was going to be that discipline that was going to carry us through. We sort of looked to Berkshire Hathaway as an inspiration. Warren Buffett, he's not going to predict the market today, but he's probably going to say, listen, I think in 10 years, this is where it's going to be. And we took the same approach. Think about when you use data or for, lack of better numbers, so to speak, is that there's an expectation when you sort of change to an objective decision-making process that you're going to be right every single time. So if you're right 3 times in a row, everybody's on board. Then the 4th time you're wrong, everybody sort of says, I told you that numbers. It doesn't tell you the whole thing. And they sort of jump back to an emotional decision-making position. But yet they don't hold, emotional decisions and to the same standard. It's not expected. And we one of the things, I think we get complimented for, which I think it's a little misguided. People, I said, well, you and your staff, you guys were such risk takers. We were actually completely the opposite. We wanted to manage risk. We wanted to be actuaries. And we thought what was risky was having information to help you make predictive decisions and not using that. That to us was the risk. So for us, there wasn't this sort of concern of, hey, you got to be right all the time. We just wanted to make a lot of decisions. If we made 5 decisions and we're right 3 out of 5, 6 out of 10, 12 out of 20, 24 out of, we wanted to leverage data to make a lot of decisions, and over the time and discipline that we would grow the gap between our process and say our opponents.
I think a really well-articulated story about the tensions between data and emotion. I want to give you the final thought here as we wrap up. I know you're doing a lot of public speaking these days, talking to people outside of the world of sports. What are some of the lessons that organizations outside of sport and business, other businesses, I guess sport is a business these days, what lessons apply when it comes to using data to rethink how they make decisions?
This may be a little bit redundant based on our conversation, Paul, but I go back to, I think with data, again, this is my experience, and is that the challenge now is that you may be in a situation, particularly for really bright, experienced people, where they will say, hey, I'm a data-driven person, and they'll point to data and they'll agree with it. But as soon as they come up with something that doesn't sort of back up their experience, they may say, well, that data is not right. And, I'm not going to use that data. So I guess in short, sort of cherry picking the data is something I think that I've seen happen. And it goes back to the statement I said about, everyone being a data person until it doesn't back up their opinion. I think the real opportunity is when you're in a room with 4 or 5 really smart, experienced people, all 4 or 5 have the same impression of something and the data tells them something else. To me, that's the real opportunity. That again, that's my experience and that's my opinion. Listen, I do think you take a really successful long-term CEO in a business, I think his experiences are a form of data. And reaching back on those experiences to help him make decisions is a form of data. But I think in many, many cases, I think when you're with experienced people, we have a tendency to sort of give them, when they say like, hey, that data, I don't, that data is not right. Well, my response usually is, well, you don't get to disagree with the data, because it's not an opinion. It's a fact. And so I think in today's world, with all the data that we have exposure to, the real opportunity is when the data tells you one thing and your own experiences tell you something else. Me personally, prefer to always sort of nod towards the data and ignore my own experiences when it comes to making decisions. And again, I know many people will disagree with that. To me, that is the opportunity, is when really smart people see the same thing and the data tells them something, because you have to assume that your competitors are probably going to see the same thing you do and probably make a decision along those lines.
Yeah, it sounds like it's as much cultural as anything else, which reminds me, I think, of the Peter Drucker quote, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast."
Well, any time I can be mentioned with Peter Drucker, I'm okay with that. So
you'll take that. Billy, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. Great pleasure to meet you, an honor to meet you. Thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Well, thank you, Paul. I appreciate it. Enjoyed it.
Excellent. Well, that's a wrap. If you've got any questions or comments about today's episode, we'd love to hear from you. Drop a line in the comment section or hit up Cloudera on LinkedIn using the handle @Cloudera with your thoughts. As always, the team's got a great array of guests coming up. So if you've enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss a drop. Thanks again to Cloudera for hosting another episode of the AI Forecast. And thank you again for listening in. We'll see you all next week.